pleasure for me to welcome you to the 6th Murphy Lecture Series. And we want to express our appreciation to the Murphy Foundation, Mr. Charles Murphy, for making this lecture series possible. I know there will be a number of you from the Murphy Corporation in the audience, and we're pleased to have you with us, as we are pleased to have all the others who have come from out of town and also our students here on campus. So welcome to the 6th Annual Murphy Lecture.
I see several vacant seats. Would you raise your hand and indicate with your fingers how many seats you have by you, and then if you're on the standing over here, fill in. On behalf of the faculty of the School of Business Administration, I'm pleased to introduce to you our 6th Murphy lecturer, Mr. Irving R. Levine. Mr. Levine joins an illustrious group of Murphy lecturers which have included Drs. James R. Schlesinger, Walter Williams, Arthur Lather, Alan Meltzer, and Ezra Solomon. All of these speakers have been brought to our campus through grants to the university from the Murphy Foundation, and we in the School of Business Administration are most appreciative of the interest in higher education of the Murphy family and wish to publicly thank them at this time. Our Murphy lecturer today, Irving R. Levine, an NBC News correspondent for over 30 years, was the pioneer in economics reporting on television. Mr. Levine accompanied Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan to the annual economic summit meetings in Puerto Rico, Tokyo, Bonn, Ottawa, Versailles, Williamsburg, and London. He traveled to Peking and Shanghai with Treasury Secretary Michael Blumenthal to cover the start of the U.S.-China trade negotiation. Levine's career as a foreign correspondent included coverage of the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Berlin airlift, the Korean conflict, the Vatican's Ecumenical Council, and the Khrushchev era, just to mention a few of his exciting assignments. He has authored 4 books, Main Street USSR, which was on the National Nonfiction Bestseller list and has been used as a university textbook. In addition, he's authored Travel Guide to Russia, The New Worker in Soviet Russia, and Main Street, Italy. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Brown University and received a master's degree from Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. Honorary doctoral degrees have been awarded to Mr. Levine from Bryant College and Brown University. Levine's journalism awards include an Overseas Press Club honor for the most outstanding radio and TV reporting from abroad, a Headliners Award, and an Emmy citation. He was the first recipient of the Martin R. Gainsborough Award for Economic Reporting. He was named to the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism's list of the most outstanding graduates on the occasion of the school's 50th anniversary. He has also been the recipient of a year's fellowship for study and research granted by the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. I am very pleased to introduce to you today Irving R. Levine. Mr. Levine.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, and thank you, Dean White, for that very gracious introduction. President Brinson, Professor Rankin, Professor Blanchard, Melinda Winton, and James Riddick, who braved a helicopter ride from Shreveport with me just a few minutes ago. I must say I'm just delighted and honored to be with you here today. And particularly pleased and gratified to be the 6th speaker on the Murphy Foundation Lecture Series. I must say this is my first visit to the Southern Arkansas University, and I must compliment you on the lovely and friendly campus which you have here. I would be remiss if I were not to express my appreciation for the courtesy and flexibility which Dean White exhibited, and which I can see you all cooperated in the change of schedule time which my work necessitated. And I understand that I certainly should offer special thanks to 5 people who didn't get the word and showed up early this morning. I hope that they did stay around, and my special thanks to them. And I do apologize for whatever inconvenience I may have caused anyone by virtue of the change. I know that I should be addressing a good many other people by name and title, particularly at a university. On one occasion, Henry Kissinger was asked how he'd like to be addressed in view of the many titles and posts which he has held over the years, and he replied, "Oh, I care nothing for protocol as long as you call me Your Excellency." So I hope that that'll take care of all the titles here today. Not long ago, I received an invitation to address a group, and the invitation concluded with the words, "We all very much hope that you can come because we're all very anxious to hear the dope from Washington." I didn't quite know how to take that. But the dope from Washington that I'd like to discuss this afternoon would come under the heading of the second Reagan administration and the nation's economy, what's ahead for the economy. I must say I'm gratified to be able to do that at somewhat greater length than is usually the case in our broadcast. Very often our reports on the evening news or on the Today Show run 1 minute and 45 seconds or 2 minutes in length, all too brief to cover the subjects that we'd like to cover. In fact, it sometimes seems to me that we're trying to establish, if not challenge, a record for brevity. I think that record probably is now held by a Judge Murdoch who presides over a Washington court. At the end of a rather heated trial, the defendant arose, made an impassioned plea, saying, "As God is my judge, I am not guilty," to which the judge replied, "He is and I am, you are." Well, I won't be quite that brief, but what I should like to do is to share with you some information, some impressions, some insights in the economic beat which I cover in Washington and in my travels. Let me start out by placing in some kind of context my remarks, which in some respects will appear to be, and indeed will be, critical of the administration, and will be critical of certain policies, and which will attempt to analyze and interpret some of these policies. And I'd like to set those in context at the outset by indicating that I think that if one is to look at the nation's economy right now, I think that as one sifts out the good statistics from the poor statistics, one comes to the conclusion that we are in a rather impressive and sustainable recovery, a recovery which began in the first 2 quarters, the first 6 months of last year, or rather in '83, went on into '84, slowed down a little bit in the last 6 months of '84, now begin an economy which is beginning to show signs of gathering steam again. That is not to say that there are not some danger signals, some problems, which I will mention and discuss at greater length. I think, too, that one has to look at some of the reasons and some of the background for this recovery. And to a certain extent, the Reagan administration, which quite understandably, as would any administration, claims credit for the recovery, does deserve a certain amount of credit. I think that the tax cuts which the President initiated in the early part of the first term were largely responsible for getting consumers spending again, and this recovery has been largely a consumer-led recovery in the early part. That is to say that consumers, by feeling confident, by having a little more money to spend by virtue of the tax cuts, went out, bought products. Merchants, having sold these products, had to reorder them. Factories, in order to manufacture the products, in order to supply the orders, had to hire more people, and consequently we saw the unemployment rate come down from a peak of 10.7% during the recession and we found people who were drawing benefits from the government in the way of unemployment insurance, welfare, food stamps, earning wages and being able to pay taxes and to contribute rather than to draw benefits. And so all of this was kind of the definition, if you will, of the recovery. And the Reagan administration, as I have indicated, I think deserves a certain amount of credit for the tax cuts, even though they did cause other problems, which I will mention. Also for reducing regulations on business, which freed up initiative and enterprise in many sectors of the economy, and this too was responsible. I think too for sensing a mood in the country that there was a desire for less government, the feeling that throwing money at problems didn't necessarily solve them. This too had its effect. And I think too that giving a kind of new atmosphere to the business community in the way of indicating that profit was not only respectable but desirable, and removing the word obscene, which in previous administrations always seemed to precede the word profit. I think that we found, too, that labor unions, having gone through the difficulties of the recession, that many union leaders and many workers came to understand that their jobs were only as secure as the company that they worked for. But the Reagan administration can take only a certain amount of the credit. A good deal of the credit goes to other factors. For one thing, there is the natural business cycle. And having found production and employment and profits reach a very low level, we found that there was a need for a replenishment, for a replacement of worn-out goods. In fact, the statistic which I find very striking is that the average age of cars on American roads today is just over 7 years, close to 7.5 years. And consequently, one can apply similar formulas to refrigerators and equipment in factories and so on, so that after a certain point, there was simply a need to buy a new car if you were going to be able to drive to work. And consequently, that simply the very effect of the business cycle of people having to replace goods, this played a very large role in bringing the recovery about. But there were other factors as well. A low inflation rate. And this inflation rate coming down in part was due to the policies of the Federal Reserve, which slowed down the economy at great pain to a great many people, but did succeed in squeezing out of the economy double-digit inflation. Inflation which was running at 10 and 11 and 12%. And once the inflation rate came down and people began to have a certain amount of confidence that their savings were not going to lose value by 10% over a period of a year, they were more willing to get out and spend some of those savings, and more willing to save more money as well and to work harder in order to have funds to save, because they felt that that money's value would be more lasting. The inflation rate reduction, which was such an important factor in our recovery and is such an important factor today, stems from a variety of other factors. For one thing, the recession itself caused restraint on the part of labor unions in their wage increase demands. And for a number of years now, we find the quite unusual phenomenon that the wage increases in major industries have indeed been running below the rate of inflation. We find, too, that the rather remarkable performance and productivity of our agricultural sector in this country has managed, despite periods of inclement weather and freezes and so on, to keep a huge supply of food, in the case of many farmers, an oversupply of food, so that food prices have remained low, bad for the farmer, but good for the consumer, and this, too, has been an important factor. And one cannot overlook the fact that we have had something of an oil glut. I realize, too, that this has imposed a hardship on many parts of the country, not least of all this particular area, by keeping oil prices low, but it has had an important effect in reducing the inflation rate and keeping prices of many products at a reasonable level, because energy plays such an important part. American industry, in that regard, has been very impressive in adapting and converting to a more efficient use of energy, and this has reduced the need for the importation of foreign oil. Not only have industries played an important part, but the ordinary citizen, the consumer, as well, through conservation. And in fact, speaking of conservation, I did see someone driving 55 miles an hour the other day. Unfortunately, it was my 18-year-old daughter backing out of the driveway. Well, having set the scene a little bit as to the recovery that we're in, the feeling that because of some of the factors, particularly the inflation factors, which do remain in place and appear to be durable, let me go on now to some of the problems. And of course, the main problem, the one which is so preoccupying Washington, the Congress, and the administration, and many people throughout the country, is, of course, the federal budget deficit. And it is huge. In fiscal year 1986, the fiscal year which will end in September 1986, it's anticipated that if nothing is done about the federal budget deficit, about spending exceeding government receipts, we'll have a deficit of about $227 billion. This will exceed the budget deficit of last year, which was $175 billion. The deficit before that was $195 billion. Now, these are enormous figures, and if they are incomprehensible, let me give you some even more incomprehensible figures by saying that at the beginning of the Reagan administration, the accumulated deficits, that is, the money which the government owed, the national debt, was $1 trillion. And at the end of the current fiscal year, unless some very drastic action is taken, the budget, the national debt will have doubled to $2 trillion. What, however, is encouraging is the fact that in recent days, the White House, after weeks and weeks of negotiations with Republican members, leaders in the Senate, have come up with a deficit-reducing package, which it is anticipated, if enacted, will reduce this $227 billion budget deficit in the fiscal year 1986 by some $55 billion, bringing it closer to $170 billion. And as the savings would continue over the years, it would bring the budget deficit by 1988 to just under $100 billion. Well, you may recall that during the campaign leading to the first Reagan administration, the president, then candidate, Ronald Reagan, was talking about a balanced budget, that is, zero deficit by 1983 and possibly 1982. Now the outlook, the hope, the wish, the dream is to get the budget deficit down to $100 billion or less and to have it on some kind of a downward trend by 1988. Let me discuss just a little bit what some of the ingredients are and what some of the very hard decisions have been to take this decision on the part of the White House and on the part of important Senate Republicans to reduce the deficit by what may, in relationship to the figures I've been mentioning, reduce it by a paltry $55 billion. For one thing, despite the very firm stance which the President has taken against reducing the growth in military spending beyond that which he has projected, finally the President, a pragmatist, recognized that he had to give ground, and indeed he has. And now the decision has been made, at least in this compromise, to limit military spending to the inflation rate anticipated of some 4% plus 3%. Now this would mean that the President has come down from a total of some 10% growth in military spending. The growth still would be very large, but at least it would be considerably less than the President had first insisted upon. Perhaps of even greater political consequence in terms of the political heat that members of the Congress will have to take if this is enacted is the decision to limit the cost of living increases for the 35 million Americans who receive Social Security benefits. Under the present law, the checks which Social Security recipients get on a monthly basis must increase each year by the amount of the inflation rate. Now this, of course, has been an enormous contributor to the budget deficit, because when we had an inflation rate of 10% and 11% and 12% a year in the 1970s, this, of course, meant billions of dollars of increase in federal expenditures. The decision made in this compromise proposal is to limit the cost of living increases to 2% a year, regardless of what the inflation rate is. Now, this immediately has raised a huge controversy, although I must say that it seems to me that some kind of limitation of this sort on cost of living increases has been necessary. It does raise the question, did the President go back on his word? And I think the short answer to it is, yes, he did. If one looks back, as I did yesterday, over the transcripts of the various presidential declarations, the declarations made by members of the President's staff, one finds that indeed the President did indicate that he would not in any way tinker with the present setup of Social Security benefits, including cost of living increases. And his spokesman, Larry Speakes at the White House, on one occasion said that when pressed on this point, that is, did the President mean in saying that there would be no change, was he referring to the basic benefits, or was he referring to the cost of living benefits as well? Larry Speakes said, there will be no change in Social Security. I repeat, no change, period. Earlier today, I had occasion to interview and to talk with Treasury Secretary James Baker, and I mentioned this to him. We were off camera at the time, so he could speak more frankly than he could on camera. And I pointed out to him, if one reads the transcript, it's clear, it's right there. And I referred to Larry Speakes' remarks, and Secretary Baker said, I was the one who coined the phrase, which the President spoke on one occasion, Presidents should never say never, but in this case, I will say never about changing Social Security benefits. So Mr. Baker, Secretary Baker, was a little embarrassed that he was the one who had given the President that particular phrase. Now, of course, the administration, quite understandably, has to rationalize this change. And again, I repeat, I think what is unfortunate is that the President went out on that kind of a limb because I think that the restrictions on the cost of living benefits are essential if we are to come to grips, along with other measures, with the budget deficit. The position that the President is taking is that a 2% increase is not a cut in benefits. But this does not address the fact that no one expects a 2% increase in inflation this year. One most reasonably can expect an increase of some 4%, which means that the average recipient of Social Security will lose about $1,600 in Social Security benefits over the next 5 years, beyond what they would have received had the cost of living benefit aspect remained unchanged. The President is vulnerable too, it seems to me, in this particular respect, because he has repeatedly stated that a freeze on Social Security benefits, on Social Security cost of living increases for a period of a year, as had been discussed before this compromise was achieved, was unnecessary, because he argued repeatedly that Social Security is, and I quote his last news conference, quote, totally funded by a tax that can only be used for that purpose. So when we talk about Social Security, we're really not getting at the deficit problem at all, unquote. Now, the President was partly right. Employer and employee payroll contributions do indeed go into a Social Security trust fund. But the fact of the matter is that the income and the payout from that fund are included in the unified federal budget figures. Consequently, if indeed there had been an elimination of a cost of living increase for Social Security benefits, there would have been a saving of $6 billion in the first year and $8 billion every year after that in the federal budget deficit. So if the President indeed were to be consistent in this erroneous position that Social Security does not affect the federal budget deficit, then why cut the cost of living increase at all, since, as he indicated, it has no effect on the deficit? Well, there is that inconsistency there, and there's no point, I suppose, in belaboring it. In any event, the President did leave himself some kind of an escape hatch, I suppose, on this particular aspect of deficit reduction by saying early on that if he were faced with a congressional mandate insisting on some limitation in Social Security, he would, as he put it, take a look at it. Now, it remains to be seen whether he will indeed be faced with a congressional mandate, because, as I've indicated, these proposals so far are simply proposals reached in a compromise between the White House and leading Senate Republicans. The House of Representatives, all of whose members face an election in 1986, may indeed not go along with any change in Social Security benefits, because the 35 million Americans who receive those benefits are a very well organized constituency, and what's most important, they are people who do vote. But as I've said, it seems to me that despite the political heat, it is an essential element in any deficit-reducing package. Let me touch very briefly on other aspects of the budget proposal. They are important, and I know that they are aspects which will affect many of you, both students and members of the business community. The other aspects of this very important proposed compromise would raise the cost of Medicare benefits for Social Security recipients, would cut back or eliminate farm price supports, student loans, crop and flood insurance, soil and water conservation programs, grants to the National Institute of Health, Export-Import Bank, financing, and eliminate the Small Business Administration. It would reduce or eliminate mass transit aid, urban development grants, and it would kill outright Amtrak, rural electrification, the Job Corps, revenue sharing with the states, and economic development programs. Well, I suppose the question can be asked whether all of these will be passed, and I'd like to come to the answer to that in a moment. But what I would like to point out first of all is why, if faced with this enormous deficit, has there been so much foot-dragging, such a great reluctance on the part of the administration and certainly on the part of the Congress to come to grips with this? It seems to me that as far as the military aspect is concerned, namely the fact that about a third of the budget goes for defense spending in one way or another, and the fact that many people have felt that some reduction in this would not endanger our national security, why has there been such a reluctance on the part of the President in particular? Well, for one thing, I think his natural and certainly not ill-founded suspicion of the Soviet Union, and secondly, I think the very enormous influence that Defense Secretary Caspar Weinberger has in the administration and on the President. I think it can fairly be said that the lineup in the administration was every member of the cabinet in favor of reducing the growth in military spending, and two members of the administration, Secretary Weinberger and the President, standing firm until the very last moment against any reduction. And I think that the frustration that this caused among many members of the administration and the cabinet was evidenced in the outburst by David Stockman some weeks ago at a Senate Budget Committee hearing which I attended. The discussion revolved upon the military pension system, and David Stockman, to the surprise of everyone at the hearing, called it an outrage and a scandal. And he said, when push comes to shove, the military will be more interested in protecting its pensions than in protecting the national security. Well, I can tell you, we sat bolt upright, and when we heard that particular comment by David Stockman, well, not unexpectedly, it evoked a very strong reaction. I guess perhaps the mildest reaction, from official quarters at least, came from Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, who called for Stockman's resignation. Others were calling for Stockman's head. The veterans of foreign wars sent the President a telegram referring in somewhat less than moderate terms to David Stockman as a 4F draft-dodging divinity student during the Vietnam War. Now, I guess David Stockman brought some of this criticism on himself by virtue of the fact that many members of the Congress have openly referred to what they call his arrogant style in his appearances in defense of the budget before various committees. I must say that if David Stockman is guilty of arrogance, it is in part, at least, and in very large part, an arrogance born of superior knowledge. I've attended a lot of hearings and seen a lot of members of various administrations testify before committees, and no one, in my experience, is more impressive than David Stockman. Rather than the row of advisors sitting behind him, David Stockman comes to these hearings alone. He does have a big briefing book with him, but I have yet to see him open that briefing book. He knows the figures in this intricate, complex, voluminous budget by heart. He knows every program inside out. And having said that, I think that with all the criticism that that has been directed at him, we will see once this particular budget is enacted, that with the kind of quiet encouragement of members of the White House staff, many of whom he has alienated, that Stockman will leave and return to private life. I think although many members of the administration will be happy, it will be a great loss both to the administration and, in my mind, to the nation. Beyond the resistance on the part of the President and the part of Caspar Weinberger to reductions in the growth of military spending, I detect another reason for the kind of reluctance, resistance, which there has been so obvious in the Congress to taking decisive action in reducing this dangerous budget deficit. There is a kind of underlying skepticism in the Congress about the validity of the warnings that somehow the sky will fall down in Chicken Little fashion unless something is done about the deficit. Why? For one reason, because there is no crisis. The economy is doing pretty well. The deficit is something that you can read about, but who really can comprehend $227 billion? It isn't something that you can touch or that you can feel or that is imposing any real pain on most people. And furthermore, many members, it seems to me, of the Congress feel that many of the same voices which issued dire warnings about the oil shortage in 1973 and 74 and said that we would be out of oil by the mid-80s, that we would be standing in lines that would be twice and three times as long as those which were experienced during the Arab oil embargo, the very same people who now are warning about the deficit. And they point out that many of these voices were raised in 1981 saying that unless something was done to keep the deficit from rising, we would have runaway inflation. Well, the deficit continued to rise, and as I pointed out, inflation came down. We were warned in 1982 that if the deficits kept rising, interest rates would go through the roof. Well, the deficit continued to rise, and while interest rates are still higher than they have been by historical standards, they have come down from the 21.5% prime rate to around 10%. In 1983, we were told that unless the deficit ceased rising, there could be no recovery. Well, the deficits did continue to rise, and as I've indicated, we've had a rather vigorous recovery. In '84, we were told that unless the deficit stopped rising, the recovery would be derailed. It could not be sustained. The deficits continued to rise, and the recovery continues. Well, I mention this not by way of indicating that the deficit is not a problem which is kind of a time bomb lying out there, but rather to indicate why there has been this kind of resistance to dealing with it in an effective fashion. Now, one of the ways which is periodically suggested to deal with the deficit, and we've been talking now about cutting spending and reducing benefits, is to increase taxes, and that is to increase the revenue which comes in, since after all a deficit is the product of two things: how much you spend and how that compares with how much you take in, whether it be on a personal level or a national level. Now, there have been attempts, suggestions by both Democrats and Republicans in the Congress to include a tax increase as part of the mix to reduce the deficit. The President has made it clear that he is opposed to any tax increase. He claims that the single most important lesson of the 1984 election was that the people do not want a tax increase. And I think, in fairness, it can be said that strong arguments can be made for the President's opposition to a tax increase. For one thing, a tax increase enacted now would hit the economy probably just at the time when the economy would be slowing down, and a tax increase would slow down the economy even further. And furthermore, there are ample loopholes, cheating, and so on, which, if dealt with, could bring in increased revenue. Let me, at this point, having covered the question of the budget deficit and the proposals, make a prediction. I think that the President will get many of the budget cuts, the elimination of many of the programs which he has sought, although probably in lesser amount than he has desired. I think, too, that we will see reductions in the military spending along the lines contained in the proposal which I have described. And I think this because President Reagan has enormous, and this is certainly not an original idea by any means on my part, enormous popularity and enormous appeal. Now, there are those who say that because the President is what is called a lame duck, it's his last term and he can't run again, that his capacity for appealing to the populace and twisting arms in the Congress is greatly diminished. I must say I don't buy that argument. I think quite to the contrary is true. For one thing, the President can point out, as indeed he does, that, quote, "I have no political future." And what he means by that is that since he cannot run again, his actions are not motivated by political concerns, but rather by what he sees as the good for the general welfare of the nation. I'm less sure about the Social Security cost of living restrictions because I think that it will meet great resistance in the House of Representatives. And somewhere down the line, I think that we will see a tax increase that will fall most heavily on business. The White House and the President have been reaching deep into their bag of rhetoric to indicate that there will be no tax increase. Larry Speaks, the presidential spokesman, was asked the other day, just how strong is the President's opposition? And in rather a novel metaphor, Larry Speaks replied, the President's opposition is as strong as 10 bags of onions. I'm not sure whether he meant peeled or unpeeled. When Senate Republicans began toying with the idea of a tax increase, the President squelched that very quickly by taking a line from a Clint Eastwood movie and saying, let the tax increasers place a tax bill on my desk. My veto pen is ready. He dared them to go ahead and make my day. Last August, President Reagan said that a tax increase would be only a last resort. By that he meant only if all of the spending cuts that he wanted were enacted and the budget deficit still were not reduced, then he would go for a tax increase. Well, he was on safe grounds because he knew that all of the spending cuts could not possibly be enacted. In November, just before the election, the President said that there would be a tax increase, quote, only over my dead body. So you may be sure that when the President agrees to a tax increase, it will be called something else. Washington loves euphemisms. The last time there was a tax increase, it was called tax equity. The time before that, it was called revenue enhancement. I noticed on Sunday, Walter Mondale, appearing on Meet the Press, found it difficult to mouth the words tax increase after the reaction he had to that proposal during the campaign. And he referred to the necessity not of a tax increase, but the euphemism he used was restoration of revenue. In talking about eliminating programs, members of Congress now, I notice, speak of zeroing out programs. Somehow that has a better ring than killing programs. But the Washington euphemism that I like best really has nothing to do with the economy. It was spoken by a Pentagon general during the first days of the Grenada invasion. You may recall that invasion's first military action was an early morning parachute drop. And the Pentagon general referred to this as a pre-dawn vertical insertion. Well, this time, the tax increase will be called tax simplification. We're hearing a good deal about tax simplification. You may recall that in his State of the Union message a year ago last January, the President called for his then Treasury Secretary Donald Regan to come forward a month after the November election so that it wouldn't be an issue in the election with a tax simplification plan. Treasury Secretary James Baker has inherited that. This morning he indicated that that plan would be ready by the early days in May. Now, the plan as presented by Secretary Regan really has a good deal of merit, but let me say this, that it can be argued that if that plan had been issued by Walter Mondale during the election campaign, the Republicans would have jumped on it, they would have protested it, they would have made it an issue, and probably successfully so in defeating Walter Mondale. Why? because the plan undercuts many of the key elements of the initial Reagan tax program. It dismembers the accelerated depreciation provisions, which are so dear and useful to business. It does away with the investment tax credit. While it cuts the average individual's taxes by 8.5%, it raises corporate taxes by about 37%. It eliminates preferential tax treatment for capital gains. It reduces the deductions for charitable contributions. It ends federal tax deductions for state and local property taxes. It limits interest deductions for non-resident property. It ends the write-offs for intangible drilling expenses and a great many other provisions which have been so useful and important to business expansion. Now, the President has called for the enactment of a simplified tax, the so-called modified flat tax, this year. While everyone, it seems, is in favor, particularly at this season of the year as we approach April 15th and tax time, of a more simplified tax system, the fact of the matter is that everyone has a different idea of what they want simplified and what they want to stay in the tax system, and that, of course, usually depends on what particular benefit the individual derives from the present tax code. Consequently, with the various compromises that will have to be made, I am doubtful whether we will see tax simplification enacted this year, and as a matter of fact, there is not at this point even a plan that the President has agreed to. At the present time, the President, opposing a tax increase, bases his budget deficit cutting strategy on a number of points. First of all, economic growth, which he says will put more people to work and they will pay more taxes, will increase profits for corporations and they will pay more taxes. Unfortunately, even though we have had a rather robust economic recovery, it is clear that economic growth alone cannot make a significant dent in the budget deficit. The President, too, bases his deficit-reducing strategy on a line-item veto, which he would like to see enacted, and that would take a constitutional amendment. At the present time, when a bill is enacted and it goes to the President's desk, he can either sign the bill as a whole or veto the bill as a whole. He cannot pick and choose the aspects of that particular bill which he wants to see become law and those which he does not. Consequently, there always occurs in the enactment of an important bill the attachment of provisions, spending provisions to benefit one constituency or another. The President would like to see a constitutional amendment which, as is the case for many state governors, would enable the President to pick and choose what aspects of a particular bill he would accept. I don't think that he will see that because I think that Congress is not about to give up particular prerogatives which it now enjoys. The President also would like to see a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget. I see nothing wrong with that. I think it might impose a certain amount of discipline, but critics see a degree of hypocrisy in that particular suggestion because such an amendment could not possibly come into force with the time that is required to get a constitutional amendment enacted. It could not possibly come into force during the Reagan administration, but it would apply to future administration that would inherit the deficits of the Reagan and previous administrations. And that aside, a constitutional amendment and all the drafts that I have seen would contain so many escape hatches to enable the Congress to have an unbalanced budget, to have spending exceed receipts in the case of emergencies, that it would provide rather a false sense of security rather than truly provide a balanced budget. I think it's interesting that the various debates over a constitutional amendment requiring a balanced budget, for some reason or other, seem to have coincided with debate over a constitutional amendment permitting prayer in public schools. On the last occasion when both of these amendments were at the forefront of debate, there appeared in the letters to the editor column of the Washington Post a letter with a rather unique and I think rather innovative proposal, namely a combination constitutional amendment, one that would permit school children to pray for a balanced budget. Well, until we achieve that, the great fear about the federal budget deficit is the fear that interest rates will go up. Why? Because the federal government, just as any individual, at some point has to borrow money if his or her expenditures exceed his or her income. And the federal government is borrowing to the tune of $200 billion a year now in order to close the gap between receipts and expenditures. The federal government borrows for available loan money in competition with private industry and individuals who seek mortgages, and this drives up the price of money, namely interest rates. Our economy is one which depends very heavily on credit for people buying homes, buying cars, buying other home appliances and big-ticket items. And if interest rates go up too high, the economy slows down and there is the danger of a recession. Interest rates, despite the heavy government borrowing, have remained fairly stable for a variety of reasons. For one thing, our economy is so attractive that there has been an inflow of some $100 billion last year from foreign countries, and this has helped finance our deficit. Furthermore, the Federal Reserve, our central bank, which plays such an important part in determining the level of interest rates, has been very restrained in its policies of late to keep interest rates down for a variety of very interesting reasons. For one thing, there is a fear among the 7 members of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors with whom I've spoken that a rise of a significant nature in interest rates might further complicate the difficulties of banks in this country. We all have read about the problems of Continental Illinois and Chicago and of other banks. There were some 70 bank closings last year, happily because of the efforts of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. The banks which closed were quickly absorbed by healthy banks. But there are at the moment some 800 banks on the so-called problem list of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, and any significant rise in interest rates would make it more difficult for these banks in terms of paying for deposits, and the Federal Reserve is very anxious not to have that happen. Furthermore, the Federal Reserve has been very restrained in keeping interest rates down because of the problem of foreign debtor nations. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Mexico, a long list, now owe United States and other industrial country banks some $700 billion. They have had a great deal of trouble making payments on these debts. The payments are tied to the interest rate in the United States. Consequently, if U.S. interest rates go up, the problem, the difficulty of Brazil and Argentina and the others in making their payments is greatly complicated, and there is a possibility of default of these nations being unable to make their payments, with the consequences of an unforeseen and unpredictable nature that this would have on the U.S. banking system or perhaps on the monetary system as a whole. In fact, many of these countries have been able to make payments only because of a kind of Walt Disney World financing which U.S. banks have engaged in lending more money to these countries, adding it to the overall total of the debt, the principal, so that the monthly payment can be made. This is known as rolling over the debt, finding some way or other to do that. And if you will forgive me for saying so, the policy really has been one based on the premise that a rolling loan gathers no is a further fear as concerns the debtor nations, and that is the fear that the debtor nations will form a debtors cartel. Well, we all know what happened when the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries formed a cartel and held something of, one might call, I suppose, a semi-monopoly on oil, enough so that they could control the price of oil and, to a certain extent, the supply. Well, a debtors cartel would have a monopoly on debt. Now, that may seem like kind of a ridiculous thing to have a monopoly on, but the fear is that if all of these debtor nations were to get together, they could dictate, just as the OPEC nations did in terms of oil, the debtor nations could dictate the terms under which they would make their payments, if at all. They could demand certain interest rates. They could demand a moratorium on debt. They could make all kinds of demands with the ultimatum, with the threat that if their demands were not met, they would all default. They would refuse to pay, with certainly horrendous consequences for the banking system. Well, this is another reason why there has been such an effort to keep these nations in a position to make their payments and to prevent interest rates from going up. Well, I want to bring my remarks to a close because I do want to leave time for whatever questions you may have and perhaps even some answers I might have. But I certainly must deal very briefly with the other deficit, and that is the foreign trade deficit. The fact that the United States is buying $120 billion more worth of goods from overseas last year than we sold. This is important in terms of jobs. There is a rule of thumb which economists have, and with apologies and exempting, of course, all the economic professors in the economics department in the room here today, the record of economists in forecasting has really not been brilliant, so much so that it has been said that the proper definition of an economist is a person who, when asked for a telephone number, will give you an estimate. Well, the estimate in this case, which economists have, is that for every $1 billion in trade deficit which we have, 25,000 American workers do not have jobs because the products which they would be manufacturing are manufactured by foreign workers to make the goods that Americans are purchasing. And so consequently, with a trade deficit of the magnitude that we have, there are some 2 million jobs which otherwise would have been held by American workers. A very large part of this trade deficit, some $37 billion, is the result of Japanese exports to this country. And only this morning, the Japanese, under very great pressure, under the threat of legislation in this country which would limit exports or even impose a heavy tariff, came out with a series of proposals indicating a willingness, a desire to make it easier for us to sell our goods to the Japanese. Well, this is the kind of exercise the Japanese have gone through over and over again, and somehow or other it has never really resulted in the kind of reduction of the barriers which now exist that would enable us to have a more equitable trade relationship with Japan, and it remains to be seen whether this particular concession will be any different. As I've said, the underlying problem with the trade deficit is that it costs Americans jobs. And we do have still a very high unemployment rate in this country. It's hanging right in there at 7.3% now for a period of 6 or 7 months, right in that range. Some 8.5 million Americans unable to find work. And this unemployment situation, while greatly improved from the depths of the recession, is not likely to show an improvement until we solve the foreign trade deficit. And we are not likely to solve the foreign trade deficit unless we solve the problem of the very strong dollar, and we are not likely to solve the problem of the very strong dollar until we reduce interest rates. These high interest rates act as a magnet on foreign currencies which come into this country to the tune of $100 billion a year, as I mentioned, and which drives up the price of the dollar, the value of the dollar in relation to these other currencies, because if a German trades in his Deutschmarks because he wishes to invest in the United States, he is pushing up the price of the dollar in relation to the Deutschmark. And we're not likely to reduce interest rates until we see some improvement in the deficit situation. And that brings me full circle to where my remarks began, and that may seem like an appropriate place to end. But before doing so and turning to questions, what I would like to do in a somewhat lighter vein after this rather heavy diet of remarks about the budget and interest rates and all the rest, is to conclude, and I suppose I do so in the spirit that one really should not speak to basically a college audience without offering some words of advice. Now, these words of advice will be somewhat less weighty than those which you usually hear from your elders, but what they consist of are 9 rules which I've picked up over the years from a variety of sources, and I offer them to you for whatever they may be worth. And the first, I suppose, applies to when you go out into the world and start a career in any particular area of your choosing. And my first rule is, if at first you don't succeed, don't try again. Try something else. My second rule is, if at first you do succeed, try to hide your astonishment. Third, and this applies to the people who are taking economics and accounting and that kind of arcane subject, if the facts don't conform to the theory, the facts must be disposed of. And fourth, this applies to everyone here in the business world. Remember that the man who can smile when things go wrong has thought of someone he can blame it on. And fifth, this applies to every classroom. To get maximum attention, it's hard to beat a good big mistake. And sixth, I guess this applies perhaps to the people engaged in tax simplification in Washington. If you think the problem is bad now, just wait until we've solved it. And seventh, this applies to all of us. When you're up to your nose, keep your mouth shut. Eighth, this rule was written by H.L. Mencken, and I guess this applies to every problem in Washington. There is always an easy solution to every human problem, neat, plausible, and wrong. And finally, this applies to all of us. When you're down and out, lift up your voice and shout, "I'm down and out." Thank you.
We'd ask you to please don't leave. Sometimes the question and answer part, we hope it'll be very enlightening. I'd like to encourage you, if you have a question, please ask it. I would ask, though, that when you ask your questions, if you will stand up so we can see you, and if you will speak out in a forceful voice so that we will not have to repeat the question, so everyone here in the auditorium can hear it. I'd like to also ask you to please ask only one question in your question, not 2 or 3. Which can be a little bit confusing to all of us. So if you'll please stand up and just speak out so we can all hear you. Thank you.
I appreciated Dr. Rankin suggesting that you only ask one question and not two, because I find that when asked two questions, I usually forget the second question by the time I've answered the first, which reminds me of the story of the 99-year-old man who had a reputation throughout the county of fantastic eyesight. It was really phenomenal eyesight. He was standing out on the golf course one day when a golfer hit a ball into the woods, and the 99-year-old man with a fantastic eyesight was standing right there, and the golfer walked over and said, "Did you see where my ball landed?" And the gentleman said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Where did it land?" And I forgot. I know it's always very difficult to be the first one to ask a question, but let's see who's the bravest of all. Yes, sir.
You mentioned about everything about the economy except the farm problem. Do you think there's too many farmers in the nation right now?
The question pointed out quite correctly that I dealt with a good many problems, but I didn't mention the farm problem, and I certainly should have. The question further was asked, do I think there are too many farmers today? Well, I suppose to answer the last part of that question first, if one assumes that a free market economy, to the extent that the farm economy is a free market economy, is the best sifter out of what the proper number of enterprises is, that what we're seeing today, I suppose, provides some kind of an answer to that, even though it would be a very cruel answer. The farm economy in many places in the country is very healthy. Some farmers are doing very well. It depends on the area of the country, the particular crop or activity that the farm is engaged in. In other places, as you very well know, there's enormous difficulty and bankruptcies and so on. The administration, with a certain amount of justification, I suppose, places a considerable degree of that blame on some farmers themselves because of land speculation, and once inflation came under control, land, which was the collateral for loans, ceased to go up, and this kind of speculation which farmers were engaged in came tumbling down, as many speculations do. Furthermore, the administration feels, and this is perhaps more debatable, that the farm support programs have, to a certain measure, been largely responsible for some of the difficulties, because crops have been raised less on the basis of demand than on the basis of what the benefits of farm programs were. And so the administration is determined to gradually, and not so gradually if it can, to do away with farm supports. It's pointed out that at the rate that milk is being produced, there's just no way that the government can continue to subsidize milk production, which is the result of subsidies rather than of demand. Butter stored in warehouses in endless quantities and so on. I think that the administration's efforts to gradually phase out farm programs will, as is true in many of the administration's efforts, be scaled down somewhat. But I think that that is the general direction in which things are heading. Yes?
Do you think the United States should trade with the Soviet Union, particularly food?
The question is, do I think the United States should trade with the Soviet Union, particularly in food? I spent 4 years in the Soviet Union, and when I first arrived there, a very eminent Soviet expert, Chip Bolin, was ambassador, and his premise was that we should try to sell the Russians, the Soviet Union, everything we could, because his feeling was that the more prosperous their economy became, the more the people had, the greater stake they would have in stability and peace. because they wouldn't want to jeopardize their greater material holdings by conflict. I had some doubts about that at the time, and I have even more doubts about it now. And I think that the various phases which our trade policy toward the Soviet Union has gone through is an indication of the difficulties in resolving the question of if we don't sell, other people will sell. That's one problem. If we don't sell them wheat, as was indicated during what I think was a very well-intentioned Carter grain embargo, then they're going to get it from Brazil or Argentina or Australia or wherever. Now, that question becomes even more critical when you get into items which have some kind of a military application. And that's where the real difficulty has come into play, because while we have tried to limit that, we find the French, to a lesser extent the British, and other countries will buy our products and then transship them. So it's a real problem. To answer your question, I personally, with the experiences that I have had in the Soviet Union and the conclusions that I came to as a result, would like to see our trade severely limited in all respects with the Soviet Union until such time, and I'm fearful it would be an unlikely time, that their policies show considerable change. I think someone here had their hand up a moment ago. Yes.
What do you expect to see in the way of economic change in the Soviet Union under Gorbachev?
The question is, what changes, did you say in the economic area or in general?
Economic change.
What economic changes would I expect to see in the Soviet Union under the new Soviet leader Gorbachev? I wish you'd asked that a more general question, and I might even answer it in a more general way. I must say that I recall when Andropov came to power, someone discovered that he liked Scotch whiskey and that he had a collection of Western phonograph records, and somehow this former chief of the KGB was, because of these Western inclinations, going to bring about great changes in Soviet outlook and so on. Well, that proved very quickly to be a false premise. In the case of Gorbachev, he made a trip to England. He was seen to be wearing clothing of a more Western cut and less baggy than the average Soviet suit. His wife was carrying a Gucci bag and so on, and somehow the feeling was, well, Gorbachev is going to open a whole new era. I have very deep doubts about that, both in the economic area and in the relations with the United States. Why? A person does not rise in that Soviet hierarchy by being a maverick. You rise in the Soviet hierarchy by virtue of conforming, by virtue of being part of a collective and adapting your views to the collective view, and sharing power, which has been very true since Stalin's day. So that I don't see any great changes taking place, even though if the Soviet Union were to bring about the changes in its economy, which are obviously so needed in providing more material goods and greater, more plentiful food supplies and so on, great changes would be needed in terms of adapting some of the elements of a free enterprise economy. I don't see that happening. Yes, sir.
Washington seems to reek with lobbyists and special interest groups. Do you see these people and this type of organization as a threat to us?
The question pointed out that Washington reeks with lobbyists and special interest groups, and is that a threat to us? I'm afraid that's a yes or no answer. The no part first. lobbying is not necessarily it's not a four-letter word, either actually or metaphorically. And lobbyists play a very useful and important function, and any congressman will tell you that. Why? There are so many things which a congressman, member of the Senate and the House, has to be acquainted with. They deal with so many subjects that it is useful to them when a certain bill is under consideration to have a person representing a particular industry to come to his office, as indeed they do, and to talk to his administrative aide or to the member of Congress himself or herself and say, now, please take into consideration that this measure will have this and this effect on our industry, which may have a subsequent effect on an industry in your district or in the country as a whole. So the lobbyists do play a very important educational process in the legislative process, and I think that you'll find every member of Congress will agree with that. Now the no side, or rather the yes side of it being a danger. There is a lot of money sloshing around out there. There is a lot of political debts which are owed because of political contributions. There are a lot of votes which are motivated, and it's perfectly legal on the basis of what the campaign contribution was made on behalf of a particular interest. That is regrettable. What the solution to that is, I don't know. Yes?
Do you think the United States should develop a Star Wars concept?
The United States should? I'm afraid I didn't hear the rest of that.
Star Wars.
Do you think the United States should develop a Star Wars concept?
Yes. The question was, should the United States develop Star Wars concept? I really don't know the answer to that. I have a personal opinion. For all that the President says about the virtues of such a system, namely that it would be a departure from MAD, that is mutual assured destruction, where the restraint is the inhibition on the first strike is that the party making the first strike knows that it will be retaliated against, to a concept where a first strike is impossible because of the defense. However, after the kind of exaggerated attributes which the President gave to that system, it's now recognized in the administration, and it is acknowledged that it can only be a kind of partially successful defense. So what you have, it seems to me, are the ingredients of an escalation, of a further escalation beyond what we have now. The Soviets aren't going to sit still any more than we would sit still for that kind of a concept. And so while the objective, the dream, if you wish, of having a defensive system which assures both sides security, it seems to me to be so dangerous in terms of build-up, escalation until that may or may not be reached, and so expensive that I think the dangers, at this point at least, far outweigh the possible benefits. Yes, sir.
One question about arms negotiations and their possible use, and I'm thinking especially about your experience in the Soviet Union's foreign correspondence, and of course this is all related to economics as well. The question is, in your opinion and with your experience, do you feel that there are some human characteristics, be they historical, economical, or out of that more ambiguous area we call human nature, which are insurmountable? And if there are human characteristics that are insurmountable in terms of arms negotiations, are we left with hope or without hope in terms of arms use?
Well, I think in the long run, we have to have hope, and I think the hope lies in this basic fact that anyone who visits the Soviet Union, even for a very brief period, comes away with, and that is the Soviet people want war no more than we want war. If anything, the Soviet people are more fearful of war than most Americans, for the simple reason that there is not a Soviet family, and I think this is not hyperbole on my part, which has not experienced the loss during the last war of a relative, a friend, a member of the family. The devastation in the Soviet Union was enormous. So once you've got that basic desire on the part of the peoples of both countries, there has to be out there somewhere some kind of hope that basic desire for peace and for the elimination of weapons has a chance. Now, I realize in saying that it may sound unrealistic and particularly uncynical for a news correspondent. And so in order not to be guilty of that, let me quickly add that the problem is that the people aren't negotiating. It's the leaders and their concern and their suspicion of the other side, and how we overcome that kind of suspicion, and how the particular expansionist aspects of the Soviet leadership and of their system becomes more moderate, and over a period of time perhaps it will. When that happens and how that happens, I don't know, but I certainly would not subscribe to what may be implied in your question, that there is no hope there. There certainly has to be, and I think the fact that we are involved in negotiations represents some small ingredient of a realization on the part of the leadership of both sides that it's mutual madness to contemplate anything beyond the hope that there is some solution out there. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you, from an economic standpoint, which party do you feel is on a better path for economic health in the United States? The Democrats seem to be under the leadership now from moderate to the left, Kennedy, Hart, Cuomo, etc. The Republican right seems to be more the leadership of Jack Kemp, Newt Gingrich, maybe even George Bush.
And your question is, which party is better for the economy of this country?
The leaders for better economic health.
I don't have to flash my Republican or Democratic button. Well, well, I'm an independent, and I think it's a fair question, and one that I'll attempt to answer. And I think the answer is that perhaps it depends on the particular time in history. And I think that we went through a period when the Democratic Party was the answer. I mean, one only has to read the history of Franklin D. Roosevelt and that period. And then I think one comes to kind of a watershed point, which perhaps was the Proposition 13 in California, which, as you recall, was kind of a representation in microcosm of a particular state which felt too much government spending. This pendulum has gone too far. And so I think that we now are at a point where the Reagan administration, and I think my remarks clearly indicated that there are certain criticisms which I've expressed, nevertheless does represent a very widespread, does reflect a very widespread economic sentiment in this country today. Now, there's a danger that that pendulum is going to go too far under the Reagan administration, but I'm not sure that the abolition of Amtrak really serves the ultimate benefit. But what that represents in that list that I read is a very deep feeling, and I know it's presumptuous to try to interpret what the nation is feeling, but I think the election results and the polls and so on do indicate that the Reagan administration, in its efforts to cut back on programs and government spending and doing what it is doing in the economy, at this particular point in history may indeed be the proper prescription. Let me add just a little parenthesis to that. There is an interesting theory, and it may indeed be right, that when you take into consideration why the president, who certainly must have been sincere in calling for a balanced budget and so on, was willing to have that tax cut, which contributed so greatly to the deficit, to have this enormous increase in military spending, and at this point to appear to be so relatively unconcerned about the deficit. And the answer to that may be that he sees in the deficit the route through which he can accomplish less government that he wants. Because without the deficit, without this enormous deficit out there, there would not be the prospect that Democrats as well as Republicans would now be engaged in this government program cutting kind of exercise. And what is most remarkable about the discussion that's going on now in the Congress concerning the deficit, concerning the budget, is that for the first time in the 14-plus years that I've been covering this area, and I think it could go beyond that, no one is proposing new programs. Everyone is in favor of reducing the deficit by different means, granted. And what you find is that the various interests and constituencies are not talking about more money, but simply in trying to protect their particular program or limit the amount by which it is cut. And that is a historic development, I believe. I think, I'm afraid I didn't hear your question.
Do you feel that we have inflation whip for at least the next 10 years?
Did someone in the...
Do we believe we have inflation whipped for at least the next 2 years?
Do we have inflation whipped for the next few years? Yes, I think we do. And for the reasons that I mentioned, and just let me touch on them very briefly. One, I think the energy surplus, if you will continue for a period of time. Two, I think that wage increases will remain moderate. And that is terribly important. Why? Because when food prices go up, it's as a result of a harvest, and that is corrected at the next harvest or in the next few months, so because the harvest comes in a different part of the country or the world. So food prices go up and down. Once there is a wage increase, that is immediately reflected in an increase in the price of the product which those workers produce. And that price increase stays there. It does not, as in the case of food prices, disappear. And so these moderate wage increases, it seems to me, have been a very important ingredient in the reduced inflation rate, and I think that that too is likely to continue. We've had, over the past few years, we had 3 years ago a 3.9% inflation rate. The year after that, 3.8%, last year 4%, and this year it's running slightly below 4%. Of course, there's only 2 months involved. And I think we have every reason to believe that that could continue for a period of time.
If all economic ties are cut with South Africa, how would that affect the economy?
The economy of South Africa?
Our economy.
Our economy. The question was, if all economic ties are cut with South Africa, how would that affect our economy? Well, we do receive certain important products, rare products, and I wish I could enumerate them, but I can't, elements which go into industry from South Africa. I suppose they are replaceable from other sources, but probably at a greater cost. I don't think that our economy would be greatly affected, substantially affected. I'm afraid I can't give you a quantitative answer, but I think that in a qualitative way, I don't think that it would have a very serious impact on our economy, although obviously certain companies which have investments there would suffer, but I don't think that that would be of a nature that would affect the economy as a whole. Yes, sir.
Iran and Iraq have been at it for many years. Do you see an end of that conflict? And secondly,
Would you repeat that part again?
Iran.
Yes.
And my second question, with your pardon, I watched you for many years on TV. Do you ever wear a straight tie?
The rule was no double questions. Well, that Iran-Iraq war appears to have no end. I don't know what I can say to add to the general knowledge. As you know, the head of the United Nations, Secretary General, went there, in fact is in Baghdad now, I believe. I think until the Ayatollah passes on to his just rewards, we're unlikely to see any conclusion. And of course, it's very dangerous because that's a conflict that can really escalate and show signs of doing that. As far as your other question, I was fearful that I might be asked the three questions that I'm always asked, and that is, one, why do you always wear a bow tie? The answer to which is, it's the only kind I have. The other two are, what does the middle initial stand for? And the third is, why don't you have a smile on television? I'm glad I haven't been asked the other two.
We probably ought to drop down to about one last question because our press conference is coming.
Good. You pick the last one.
You want me?
Yes. No, to pick the... Yeah.
You seem to have concluded that there will be no limit to the budget deficit. It's going to go on and on and on and on and on. The only thing is it may be reduced a little bit. You care to predict and speculate where out here will the debt become so large that it will tip us over?
Well, I was about to say I'm glad you asked that question, but I am, because I'm afraid I left you with an impression that I didn't mean to leave you with. In making the predictions that I've made, I indicated that I thought the President would get his way on most of the spending cuts, although in lesser amounts. I think that the military spending will be reduced, and I think there will be a tax increase. All of which should contribute to bringing the deficit down, and every time you make some kind of a cut, that goes into future years. For example, on the Social Security benefits, I mentioned if they were to freeze it for 1 year, you'd have $6 billion saving in the first year. Why? Because it applies to the fiscal year and consequently have a fewer months. But it'd be an $8 billion saving every year after that. Why? Because that increment will not have been received in the first year, and it will not be received every year after that, and any cost of living increase will be applied to a lesser amount. So there is reason to believe, it seems to me, that while we're not going to see a balanced budget as far down the road as I can see, that with the Congress beginning to come to grips with this, with a reasonably vigorous and sustainable recovery, which I do think we are going to have, with continued low inflation, which is important in one respect for the government, because the government also has to buy products, I think we can see this budget deficit coming down to perhaps the $100 billion figure, which is projected for fiscal year 1988. Now, that's in terms of a growing economy. It means that proportionally it is smaller than a $100 billion deficit would be today, since the economy presumably will grow. So I do see a downtrend. I don't see a balanced budget in the foreseeable future, but I don't see us reaching the point that you described in your question, which I translate to mean, when can the government cease borrowing money or having to pay such interest rates that the economy comes to a halt? No, I don't see that happening, and I'm pleased that you asked that question so I could conclude my remarks by trying to set what I've tried to say in some kind of proper context. Thank you, and thank you all for your attention and your hospitality.
Well, what I was going to say, they have it on tape, so if you have any problems, I'm Dr. Lampkin.
Dr. Lampkin?
Right.
Okay.
And just see us over at School Business
Oh, great.
Administration.
Thank you very much.
Uh-huh. Well, we have to take all this down.
I know I'm getting you. I'm out on the street.
Here you go, right here.
Oh, thank you.